Hey, welcome to Rational Animal. Today we're going to be talking about the Crusades, and in particular, the First Crusade. And with me today is my friend Dennis Knapp, who did his master's thesis on this subject. And we're honored to have him with us to talk about this today. So, Dennis, can you give us a little bit of background about your educational background, your academic interests, that sort of thing?
Sure. Well, I have a master's in military history, and I did my master's thesis, as you said, on the motivation of the Freeman farmer during the First Crusade, which is a kind of a class of fighter that gets overlooked a lot of times in the discussion on the Crusades. And I also have a bachelor's in history as well. I did my master's at Norwich University, which is one of the top schools in the country for military history. I did my undergrad at a Catholic school in Milwaukee called Cardinal Stritch University. And like I said, most of my degrees are in history. Uh, and what led me to be interested in the Crusades is because it's such a crucial, um, even relevant, 1,000 years later topic. And so I wanted to tackle, uh, kind of why people would take up such an expedition, go to a place they've never been, and risk life and limb and everything for um, for a goal. So that was what motivated me to study it.
Great, yeah. Okay, so I guess my first question is, what were the Crusades? If you could give us like a brief sketch of what they are, but also then kind of start into what is it that motivated the First Crusade?
Well, there are some varying thoughts on what a crusade is. I'm a more of a traditional, I have a more traditional view on the Crusades, which basically means the Crusades were a pilgrimage that were supported and endorsed by the church to accomplish a goal. Um, and then if you accomplished that goal, you were granted a plenary indulgence, and that means that you would get the forgiveness of your sins, and you'd also reach your goal, and which is the goal was the liberation of Jerusalem from the hands of the Seljuk Turks or Muslim Turks. So that, in a nutshell, is what the Crusades were. They were a pilgrimage, an armed pilgrimage to the Holy Land to liberate it from the Muslim Turks, Seljuk Turks, um, and to bring it back into Christian hands. Um, so, in a nutshell, that's what they were.
Okay.
Some people would say later on there was a second, third, fourth Crusades, and then as crusading got to be a little more long in the tooth, it was then looked upon as, okay, do you have to actually go to Jerusalem? Can you then attack people that are heretics in your country? And is that a crusade? So there's differing views about what crusades were. And then also like the one of the time, well, in 1204, the crusading armies that were on their way to the Holy Land,
Hmm.
well, they decided Constantinople's closer, so they conquered Constantinople in 1204. So there was a lot of flexibility later on, but we're talking about the First Crusades, which I think is kind of the Crusades that encapsulates the ideal of what a crusade is, and it's also a successful crusade. So it had a goal, it had a mission, it had participants who bought into that mission, and they went and they fulfilled it eventually.
Okay.
So that's what I would say is in a nutshell what the first crusades were.
Yeah, and I mean, I hear the start of the First Crusade was really Pope Urban in his address, where he seemed to be calling for it. Why would he do that? Like, what were the things that led up to that?
So the history behind the first crusades were, as we looked at as we all learned back in our high school history class, there was the Roman Empire, and then the Roman Empire eventually became two, the Western and the Eastern Empire. The Western Empire being focused in Rome, and the Eastern Empire being focused in Constantinople. So basically, everything east of what we would consider the Eastern Europe like Serbia and Kosovo and all those places were kind of like the dividing line between East and West. So everything west of that would be West, would be the Roman Empire, the Western Roman Empire. Everything east of that would be the Eastern Roman Empire. And so that's how that's sort of the focus of the powers were concentrated. Now, when the Muslims came about in the seventh century, um, sixth and seventh century, they basically ran through and conquered northern Africa all the way up into Spain and into the Holy Lands, and were threatening Byzantium or Constantinople. And the reason the emperor, well, it starts with the emperor of Byzantium requesting aid from the West in Pope Urban. So the Battle of Massacres was the battle where the Byzantines lost to the Seljuk Turks, Muslim Turks, and that kind of was the impetus, not kind of, was the impetus for the East believing themselves not as a strong position as they were before, and seeking aid from the West. And so the emperor that was captured, he was actually, I don't know what happened to him. I think he was executed. But the emperor after him was Alexos the First, Komnenos, and he sent a letter to Pope Urban II requesting aid. Now, what he was thinking he was going to get and what he actually got were two different things. He was thinking that the West would send aid in terms of soldiers that would be underneath his command, and that he would use them to fight back and regain the land that was taken by the Seljuk Turks after the Battle of Massacres. So he was looking upon them as a way to as a force that he could use, and what he got was something totally different.
Was that battle the result of just Islamic expansion? Is that what?
Well, I would say it was a result of the East being not as prepared and not as organized, and there was a lot of as you can see in history where you have generals vying for power, and you have people going back and forth between leadership, and that creates instability, and that's what the status of the East was at the time. Is that they were not very organized. They were kind of living on their laurels and believing that they were something more than what they were. And then they came across an enemy that was really organized and had it was a very new empire, and so they were very hungry. And so I think that they like Rocky, right? they were like Apollo Creed, thinking that they had that same ability they had before, but they just they came up against an enemy that was more hungry and stronger.
Okay.
And so what that, like I said, led to was that request to Urban in the West. And now Urban, to give context about what the Catholic Church was going through at the time, is this is during the Avignon papacy. And Urban was, and is considered the proper pope, but he was the pope in Avignon. There was an anti-pope in Rome. And so his position of power was kind of in a precarious, and some people believe that he kind of used this as a way to gain popularity and kind of consolidate power and kind of motivate the nobles towards a cause that he backed. So that's also something that some people believe is why the Crusades happened from Urban's perspective.
What do you make of that?
I don't know. I believe that Urban, and like I said, what we're going to get into here too is to not kind of read into people's motivations from a 21st century point of view. I'm going to try to reflect the moods and the thoughts and the beliefs of people back then. And I believe that Urban had as his motivation a good intention. I think he did see that, the Holy Lands, the lands of Jesus, were overrun by what he would be considered, they wouldn't be considered infidel, because that's kind of like the other side calling us, right? So he would say that they're, by the non-believer, by the, the Muslim, he would be wanting that to be brought back into Christian hands. And also too, once once the land of Palestine and Jerusalem was conquered uh, by the Muslims, the first Muslims to conquer that land were not the Seljuk Turks. Um, so those who first conquered it, they were more tolerant of Christians than the Seljuks were, and so the Seljuks basically were ones that were they were not very kind to pilgrims, and so there was a lot of pilgrims complaining about harassment.
What do you have any idea like what kinds of harassment they were reporting?
Yeah, they were reporting beatings and threats, and probably there were some people who took extra measures and killed pilgrims, and so there was this sense that the pilgrims were being threatened and beaten, robbed and killed, and we need to liberate the Holy Lands to make sure that those who want to go visit the land where Jesus was born and lived and died and rose again could be free to do so. But there's another thing that I want to talk about too is why would a knight who has, well, let's just back up a little bit. So back in the medieval society, there were different classes of people. At the very tip top were the nobles. Those are the landed gentry. Those are the ones who had the big estates and all the serfs, and they also had knights underneath them that were there with their retainers, and they would serve them in battle. And then below them, you'd have like the freeman farmer, who would be like, basically like someone who was granted land, who was free, who was not a serf, who was not attached to the land in a way that he couldn't leave, but he had to answer the call whenever his lord requested his service. And so in that relationship was a symbiotic relationship in the fact that the Lord gave land, but the freemen and the knights that were of the freeman class in response to that gave their service to that lord, mostly as like infantry, and like the guys that would be in the middle of the field, they would have their own armor, they'd buy their own armor, they would outfit themselves, but they wouldn't be like a rich enough to have like a horse or five horses, or they wouldn't have necessarily retainers of their own, but they may have a couple people helping them out in the battlefield if the need came up for that. So that's kind of where I wanted to start too, with the fact of these were landed nobles who were very wealthy, and and going on crusades was not a cheap uh, endeavor, especially for like what I'm talking about, the freeman farmer. They had to basically sell land at a loss, and it cost them like six times their annual what would be considered an income to go. So it was something that they sacrificed a lot of of possessions and money, and they had to to sell land mostly to the church, in response to needing money for the road. So it was a very expensive endeavor. So not something that was taken lightly.
Sure. Yeah. So once Urban made this call, what kind of happened? What culturally happened in Europe? Who were the main actors? That kind of thing.
Well, I have actually here. I'll read you the what's called the privilege of Urban, which is basically what Urban said
Oh, great.
to the knights.
Yeah.
He said, "Whoever goes on the journey to free the Church of God in Jerusalem out of devotion alone, and not for the gain of glory or money, can substitute the journey for all penance for sin." Now, culturally, at the time, you have, like I said, you have these knights, these nobles, and what did I say? There's a exchange, a feudal exchange that they call feudalism, in which the knights are then attached to a higher noble, and then that noble then may fight another noble, and that knight then has to answer that call to fight them. Now, these are all Christians fighting each other in battle, and so in that at that time, and as we look now, murder and killing that's not justified in terms of like self-defense and that and then just war theory wasn't necessarily developed at this time, but the Crusades definitely helped to develop that train of thought. Was if you're fighting and killing your fellow Christians, then you are committing a mortal sin. But this is your job to fight. So there's a disconnect with you as a Christian, and these are devoted Christians. There's not like half Christians or people that just say they're Christians. They're very devoted, and they believe it. But they also know that they have an obligation to their Lord to fight for them. And so these are Christians who believe they have mortal sin on their soul and thinking that because of their occupation, basically, they're going to go to hell. And Urban is giving them an opportunity to use those abilities and those skills, those deadly skills, to liberate Jerusalem. And then if they accomplish that goal and they liberate Jerusalem, then they're granted that indulgence, which will take away all the previous sins they committed while they were in Europe fighting each other.
Yeah, so a cynical reading of that would be, right, he's trying to hold on to power or secure his power, and he does so through this religious means, right, by granting them this penance. And what do you make of that kind of cynical reading?
Well, you can also say too that as a different way to look at that cynical reading is, hey, Urban is tired of these Christians fighting each other, and so he's trying to direct them to fight other people that aren't Christian. Because you can say, well, it's okay if they kill Muslims. That's okay to Urban, right? It's just not okay for Christians to kill Christians, which is kind of where he, if you look at a cynical way, that he's trying to get him to focus on something external rather than fighting amongst themselves internally.
And at this time, right, Europe wasn't like these well-defined states that just had international relations. Like the church seemed to take on that role at that time in the West, right? The sort of international relations. So is that accurate? And
Yeah,
if so, was that almost part of his job at the time?
yeah. There's a lot of mixing of church and state. I would say that the Pope did have land that he was the Papal States and that sort of stuff, where not the Papal States but Papal land at the time, where he was actually a landed, uh, would be considered a noble, but he wasn't a noble, but a landed personality that had an army and did command. There are actually popes in the past that did command armies, so but there's a lot of mixing of that. Um, I would say that the church's influence on like the nobility in terms of how they wanted things to go, the power they really had over the nobles was the power of excommunication. So if a noble or a king did something that was not viewed upon favorably by the church could excommunicate that noble or king. And then once they excommunicated that noble or king on paper, that noble or king no longer had his retainers, or those who are tied to him through feudal law, are no longer obliged to follow that. So it kind of removed that bond that he had between himself and his knights. Not that that was ever carried out very often, or not that I was ever they would because there's loyalty like teams and that we have see now. There's like the team loyalty. So a lot of times nobles that were in trouble with the church, um, they may ignore it, and their people may not fall,
Mm-hmm.
turn their back on them. But there are stories where nobles who did fight against the church, they ended up being excommunicated, and then the church, and then the bishop or the pope would say, now in order for you to come back in, you need to do penance, wear sackcloth and ashes,
Mm-hmm.
and come back, and then we'll forgive you. And there's been cases of that as well.
Right.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yeah. No, thanks. So it seemed like um, once the call was made, right? I hear there's this cry, right? That the cries out of the is Deus Vult, God wills it, right? That was sort of
God wills it.
was
Yep.
the cry of the the Crusaders, and then it seemed like there were people who were raised up, both in a more formal sense, and then also it seemed like there were groups that raised up that the call to fight that were not quite so organized, maybe a little more.
Yeah, like the People's Crusade,
Right.
under Peter the Hermit.
Yeah.
Now that, I mean, as you can see with the West, there is this fervor that develops around the Crusades as they're organizing, as they're getting ready to go. There's also famine and a lot of hardship in Europe at the time. And so this fervor of getting ready to go kind of heated up the peasants, those who couldn't afford to go, but maybe didn't have anything else to do and were kind of frustrated with their own life. And so they were probably thinking, why not go and do this thing that Urban is asking us to do? Why does it have to be the nobles? Why does it have to be the princes? Why can't we just go on our own and try to accomplish this thing? So they actually went ahead of the princes, what they called their army, and they were led by Peter the Hermit, and there were some very low-ranking knights that were among them, but nothing near what was coming later with the princes. And eventually they did make it to Constantinople, and Alexis did allow them passage into the Levant, is what it's called, or the Holy Land. And then once they got to the Holy Land, they were all massacred. But except Peter the Hermit wasn't. He actually left them to their own devices and went back to Constantinople, and then joined up with the main crusading army when they came through with Bohemond and Raymond,
Yeah.
and those guys.
I heard it was kind of a rowdy bunch. That there was that was one of the groups that was kind of put something of a stain on the First Crusade, and I mean even the church had to get. Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, the church didn't endorse it. They did not support it, and they did commit massacres. And on the way, because they had no food and had no money, the only way they could survive on the road was to steal and kill on the way. So, yeah, it's not a very good look, optics, as they call it today. Not very good optics for the Crusade. And like I said, I'm not here to defend the Crusades as like a thing that, was that all the things that happened were good and that Christians should take up arms and that sort of thing. I'm saying is that when you look at the Crusades in context of their time and what the Crusades was meant to do, and those who won the Crusades and how those who won the Crusades looked at it, I would say we can give a good idea of their motivation and what they did and why they did it, and what they were trying to do. I think we can look at the data, we can look at the histories and say, we can get a good idea that these people were sincere, and they actually believed what they were doing was right and the will of God.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's why and then they had things that happened along the way that kind of reinforced that, like finding the spear destiny, or the spear that they believe pierced Christ's side, in Antioch. So there's certain things that happened that they saw as signs that this is something that God wanted them to do.
Now you're talking more broadly about the campaign, right?
Yeah.
Because we've gone from talking about the People's Crusade to now more broadly speaking, the nobles, princes getting involved and heading down there, right? So.
So I'm on the opinion. So you want to talk about them, the nobles and princes, and all those they brought with them?
Yeah, I mean, if you can contrast the two, maybe, or what kind of contrast, what kind of comparisons are there between them and say the People's Crusades?
Well, it's a much larger group. I would say the People's Crusade, maybe 20,000, and those are not a very trained bunch. Like basically a ragtag group of people, like 20,000 people walking to the Holy Land, causing a lot of riffraff and trouble. Now the main crusade, some scholars estimate just conservatively at 60,000 fighting fighting men, and that's not counting the what also goes into that, like cooks and valets and those people who aren't going to fight, and those also don't count the people that are going to follow along and help them out, like just someone that's trying to serve a lord or get into service with the lord or serving one of the lower nobles. Those people aren't counted either. So the $60,000 60,000 fighter mark is for those who actually went to fight. And of those, you're looking at 9 are main princes. Two of the most important are Raymond of Toulouse, and Bohemond. He was basically a main noble from Italy, and Raymond of Toulouse was from France. And so those two had the main number of knights underneath them when they went on the crusade. And then when you look at the Crusader history, they're the guys that are kind of talked about the most too.
Okay.
So, yeah.
And I think Pope Urban, right, basically was kind of doing some orchestration of this, right, where he was saying like meet up, was it in Constantinople or something like that on a certain date? Like he was actually, or was that the emperor saying that? How did they know where to meet up? Like, how did that happen? Did it happen? And then what took place after that?
Well, they had a set time where we're gonna head out. I don't know if it was October or one day they're gonna head out, starting going to the east together. So they all kind of rounded up their troops, and I think you have a map showing kind of where they were, where they started, where they kind of joined, and then where they kind of went to Constantinople.
Okay.
Now, like I said, Alexis was thinking he was going to get some fighters to help him. He was not expecting an army of 60,000 knights to camp around his city, waiting to go to the Holy Land. Because also, when you talk about medieval warfare, the main way that medieval warfare was fought was what's called siege warfare. So Alexis one day sees a bunch of European noble knights coming towards the city, and eventually 60,000 of them surround his city. And so him knowing how warfare is handled sees this as a threat, as anybody who would see it as a threat would. Anybody who's familiar with warfare would see 60,000 fighters, good fighters, amazing fighters, surrounding your city is not a good thing. So his goal is to get those guys out of there as soon as possible. So he calls the 9 noble princes and tells, hey, listen, I will ferry you across the little peninsula that's between the between the Levant and Constantinople. And what I do require, though, is that you swear fealty to me. So the knights, the princes were asked to swear that if any lands that they conquered in the Holy Land would then go back to Alexis and the Byzantine Empire, which is how Alexis, I think, wanted to reclaim some of his land without actually having to do the dirty work. So most of them did. 8 of them did. Raymond of Toulouse did not. He refused to do so. But Bohemond did, and the other princes. Now, this actually came about later, where they started conquering cities. The emperor was expecting them to hand over the land, hand over those cities to the empire, but then the knights basically, or the princes, decided not to do that.
Do you know why?
Because they wanted land.
Because they wanted land.
Plus, I mean, so like you said, we start off, just to give you an overview of like the numbers, right? A numbers game. So we start off with 60,000, or did I say 65 or 60? Between 60 and 65,000 fighters. About 6,000 probably are mounted knights. The majority are foot soldiers. By the time we get to the last battle, um, after the liberation or the conquest of Jerusalem, that number is around 13,000.
Wow. 13,000 total?
Yeah, total.
Wow.
So that is a combination of, they conquered cities, and so some stayed behind, but those who ended up going to Jerusalem and defending Jerusalem after its liberation or conquest, however you look at it, was about 13,000.
Hmm.
But now when you look at those 65,000, and you see there's that's 1095, and I think they liberate Jerusalem in like 1101. So they have about like 5 or 6 years of fighting, to where they are now a band of brothers, to use the modern term. And so they fought with each other, they've bled and suffered. So they're a far fewer but far greater fighting force at the end than they were at the beginning, because when they were going into the Levant, to the Holy Land, they didn't really know what to expect. Most of them hadn't even ever fought armies in the East or Muslim armies, so they didn't know what to expect. And so a lot of their failures in the beginning were due to their lack of understanding of warfare in that part of the world.
Mm-hmm.
Because not only were they familiar with siege warfare, but the way the battles were fought in Europe were, you did have foot soldiers that would line up against each other, and they would fight, back and forth. And then the knights would be like on a high rise or on a hill, looking over the battle. And then once they saw like a break in the line, they would go full force down the hill towards that break in order to penetrate that line. So if you imagine, you're a foot soldier fighting, and then you're doing your job and you're winning, all of a sudden the nobles on the hill see it's going their way, and so they send 300 mounted knights hauling what down the hill towards
Mm-hmm.
your position. And what happens then to the enemy that sees that, they basically run, because anybody, I think, would run away if they saw 300 mounted knights coming at them with spears going about, I don't know how fast a horse can run, but like 40 miles an hour. So
Yeah.
that was kind of how warfare was done in Europe. But when they go to the East, that's not how they do it. Even like how you would use in the West, they had mill horses, and they would train them since they were very young to be able to run into battle, because a horse or even an animal's inclination is not to run towards pointy things that can hurt them. So they had to train them to do that. So
Mm-hmm.
these are highly trained horses, that are able to withstand a lot of stress in battle, a kind of an extension of a knight.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have in the East, they also used horses, but they used mares or female horses. And their strategy was to ride up to an army, shoot arrows, and then get out of there.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a totally different kind of warfare. And so when you see like some of the first battles of the Crusades, the Crusaders are thinking, okay, we're going to get lined up, we're gonna we're gonna do this how they do it, and then they see a bunch of warriors come in, shoot arrows at them, and leave, and they're like, that's not very not chivalrous, but because I don't think, that's not a word they would think, but that's not very honorable
Mm-hmm.
way to fight, because nobles were like, or knights were like, their sword hand, in their face with each other, very much a manly kind of get in there and tussle kind of endeavor with fighting. And then having some army come up and throw arrows at them and then run away, for them was something they didn't even contemplate would be the tactics they would use.
Okay, so can you give us a little bit of a timeline? Just kind of went from when Urban II actually makes the call to, okay, now they're supposed to meet up in Constantinople, then they start actually battling, all the way down to the time when they make their way down to Jerusalem.
Well, Urban makes the declaration in 1095, for the Crusade, for the pilgrimage, the armed pilgrimage, as I'm going to call it. And then from that, you sort of they muster their troops, and then they make the long march towards Jerusalem. And they get to Jerusalem. Sorry, they long march towards Jerusalem, but on the way, they stop off at Constantinople in 1097. And then from that, they cross over, and then they go to their first. Nicaea is one of their first main cities they hit, and that's in 1097. And then they go down further to Antioch. And then I have to look at that map, but then eventually in 1099 they hit Jerusalem and liberated in 1099. So you're looking at 4 years from declaration to completion.
Okay.
Well, declaration to completion, but then they're there a little bit after. So I would say they stop the Crusades officially like 1101, even though they fulfill the needs of the Crusades, or that penance or the what do you call it, the obligation, in 1099. But I think too, some of the knights that ended up not going to Jerusalem, they had to eventually go and kind of make an appearance, even though they're not liberating anything. So like Bohemond, he didn't march on Jerusalem. He wasn't part of that battle. But later on, he actually came and kind of showed up in Jerusalem. And on paper, I guess you can say he officially satisfied that requirement, because he went to Jerusalem. But he didn't liberate it. He didn't fight to liberate it.
Okay. Yeah. So and as they went in to retake the land, how many major battles were there? How did the Crusaders fare in those battles? Like what? Like you mentioned the different tactics. How did they handle that? How did they eventually overcome that?
So when Crusaders were forced on to fight in open terrain without using siege warfare, they suffered heavy casualties, because the way they fought was not the way that the Crusaders fought. You know, with the horseback and the arrows, and there was not a lot of that engagement that they were used to. Mm-hmm. So in that regard, they lost. They had a lot of attrition through that kind of battle. But once they started to do what they were best at, which was siege warfare, that's when they started to see success. So when they would, besiege Nicaea, and then the Nicaeans eventually would give up, because they saw that there was nobody coming to protect them, or no one to liberate them. The most crucial city that I think is part of the Crusader story is Antioch, because that city was probably the biggest and most well fortified city in the Holy Land at the time. Mm-hmm. And so it was a very tough nut to crack. And it was only liberated because someone on the inside, Bohemond, had bribed to get access to a tower. And so they're able to go through. And also it's kind of interesting too, in the stories about what motivations were what, is that there's a story that Bohemond had this guy in his back pocket, so to speak. And so they had a council of all the nobles, or all the princes, and he said, listen, I think that whoever conquers this city, the first one inside should take control of it. Wow. What does everybody think? And then he basically got in. He was the first one in, and he was able to get into the city. Now, the way Antioch was structured, it's kind of like, a circle, and in the middle of the circle there's a citadel, right? And around the citadel is like the main city, kind of like a donut, right? There's the citadel right in the middle, and around it is the city, and all the houses and everything, or not estates, but where people lived. Mm-hmm. So as soon as the Crusaders got into the city, and while they were trying to attack the citadel, or the people who were running the city were, and they were able eventually to overthrow that citadel. While they were doing that, a Muslim army, soldier Turks, came up and started to besiege them.
Wow.
So
And,
you have the Crusaders getting in, the trying to control the city, and then you have army besieging them. And so basically, they were now starving after that point, and also they're trying to send for aid from Alexis, but that wasn't coming. And so that's when you hear stories about cannibalism. Um, a lot of those horses that those nobles brought were probably eaten at the time.
mm, hmm
Um, and it's funny too, and not funny, but there's accounts that towards the end, when they're liberating Jerusalem, people are, riding donkeys, they're riding camels, they're riding whatever they can get their hands on, because the horses they brought with them, most of them didn't survive.
mm,
They were either killed in battle, starved, or starved and were eaten.
right.
And
Okay.
then while these people were being surrounded by the soldier Turks surrounding them in Antioch, that's when some of the accounts of cannibalism were coming about, where the Crusaders were according to some accounts, like carving up deceased city inhabitants and eating them. That's how bad it got.
Hmm.
And like I said before, when you talk about miracles and motivations, well, and this is the city where they found the spear of destiny, or the spear that Christ pierced his side, and the Crusaders saw this as a sign that God was on their side. So they used this as motivation to go meet the soldier Turks in battle, and they ended up defeating them.
Hmm.
So that's how they got out of that little scrap. Um,
How long a period of time was that siege? Do you know, in Antioch?
um, I would say about 5 months. I would say about 4 to 5 months.
Okay.
I have to be sure. I don't have it in front of me here, but I believe it wasn't a short siege by
Mm.
any accounts. And so they liberated Nicaea, then they liberated Antioch, then they did Edessa was one of the cities they also liberated right after that. And so they're having some success in the Holy Land. And once they started having success, they ended up not going any further towards Jerusalem. And the lords that came, the princes that came, started to act like the princes they were back in Europe, and they started to like encamp themselves and started to act like lords, and kind of were stalling the progress to Jerusalem. And this is where the issue of motivation comes up a lot, because when you look at, and this is what I wrote my paper about, because when you look at the motivation of nobles, and you say, okay, well, they came up, they had the same oath, they took the same vow, when you put the cross on your sleeve, you're basically obliged to complete the pilgrimage and complete the obligation,
Mm-hmm.
or you would be like ostracized from society. So
Hmm.
they all took the same oath, but when they got over there, the nobles and the high nobles, the princes, started to not want to complete the journey. And so when you look at the motivations, that's when a lot of the critics of the Crusades would say, listen, look what the princes were doing. Like, they were coming over, they were conquering lands, and they just sat there. They were not in any regards, there's no sense of urgency. Because you see, like, Nicaea is 97, uh, and Jerusalem's 99. So for 2 years, there's not a lot of, there is movement, but you can think they probably could have conquered Jerusalem within a year if they just kept going, but it took them 2 years to get there. So, and that's because, like I said, they stalled.
Was there something that pushed them to continue on?
Yeah, that's what was the subject of my paper. Were the Freeman Farmers, or what we call the Freeman Independents. And so they were the, like I said, the foot soldiers. They were the ones that actually gave up the most to go on crusade, because these princes had a lot of wealth, so to actually go on an expedition and have a lot of horses and have a lot of, they didn't have a lot of, um, they had a lot of resources.
Hmm.
the the Freeman Independents had very little resources, and all they did have, they sold and spent more than they had to actually go on the Crusades. So I would say they were way more invested in this journey, in this pilgrimage, than say the princes were. And this is shown in how, especially there's an event that happened in the town of Mara, in which one of Raymond of Toulouse, it was his men. He had conquered that city, and he had commanded his men to build ramparts and to fortify it. And he was going to a meeting amongst the princes in Antioch to discuss their plans and what they want to do. And what happened while he was gone was that his men, instead of building up battlements, they tore them down. And they left the city bare for invasion. And so when Raymond got back, he saw what was happening, and he asked his men, what are you doing? And they said, listen, we came here for a reason, and you left us here to just conquer lands for you and not to complete this journey. We're not going to go anywhere. We're not going to fight for you until you promise us that we're going to complete this journey. Because not only are our souls on the line, but the souls of everybody who's died on this journey is on the line. So they looked at themselves as someone who said, listen, I have this burden. I have my own mortal sin, and I have the sin and the ultimate judgment of those people who died on the journey, that if we don't complete this mission or this crusade, then they're gonna die, and they're gonna stay in hell or suffer in hell, and they wanted to complete it.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I have a quote here. So this is from a book I read for this called Medieval Canon Law in the Crusader, and this is Brundage. This is the author's name. Mm-hmm. And he said the princes strove with each other and with the rest of the Crusades to establish a dominant position of leadership. The magnates to become princes, the lowers to prove themselves worthy as magnates, deserving of praise and glory. So that was the status of the Crusades at the time where it stalled.
Okay.
So William, Archbishop of Tyre, in the History and Deeds of Duns Beyond the Sea, wrote about the Crusades at this time. They complained to each other that the leaders were ever trying to invent excuses for delay, and that the main objective of the pilgrimage seemed wholly forgotten. Whenever a city was taken, the chiefs at once began to wrangle and fight over the question of its possession. Thereupon held a meeting of their own and decided that as soon as the Count Raymond happened to be away for any reason, they would destroy Mara, and thereafter they might be nothing to hinder the accomplishments of their vows. And that's from Archbishop William of Tyre, writing a little bit after the Crusades, but he is clear that the Crusaders were sick and tired of nobles delaying the ultimate end of the Crusades. And so when Raymond came back, they said, listen, you need to promise us we're going to go, or we're not going to fight for you. And the penance he had to do was he actually had to walk down the center of Mara in sackcloth and ashes as a sign that he was repentant of his delay of the crusade. So once they were satisfied that that's what he wanted to do, he then led them to Jerusalem and the taking of the city. And I think there's only two nobles that are the two princes that actually went. Raymond, I think, and I think Robert were the two that actually went to Jerusalem to liberate.
Okay. And how long was that siege? You know,
that siege was not as long as the other two. They were able to build battlements and structures to actually get over the wall into the city fairly quickly, and so they were able to take the city, compared to like Antioch and Nicaea, very fast. Now this is also where they talk about massacres too, is that for someone in Europe, sorry, going into a city and taking it over, they're not going to really know what a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian looks like, because they all pretty much dress the same. And so they just killed whoever they found. Then they didn't ask what their affiliation was when they did that. There's a noble knight called Tancred, who was like if you look at like his history, he's kind of like the epitome of a chivalrous knight of this time. He gave some people who were hiding his standard as a way to keep them safe, but they ended up being slaughtered anyway. So there was some attempts at some of the Crusaders to keep that from happening, but there's a lot of that went on.
So do you know of any of the Crusaders who were deserters who had left? Do you have any stories regarding some of those folks?
Well, I didn't really do a lot of research on the deserters. I mean, I did come across stories of them, like I said, of those people who left, and then kind of because it was hard, and then some ended up coming back and satisfying that obligation of the crusade, or their vow. But mostly what I focused on was those who accomplished the goal and why they did it. Because when you look at the history of the Crusades, like you said before, you see knights, especially lower knights, the Freeman Farmers, accomplishing or motivating the princes to finish, where the princes were squabbling and vying for territory and fighting amongst themselves about who gets what. Those who had suffered the most, who had given up their possessions, who had put themselves in debt to go on the crusade, had the most to lose if they didn't accomplish it, in terms of like their honor, their, like I said, their soul. I focused on them because they don't get a lot of attention, but there was a reason why the Crusades were successful, and it wasn't because of the princes. The princes were not the ones who, I mean, while they led the army and while they had the standard that everybody kind of rallied around, it was the freeman farmer, the lower knights, who motivated and kind of pushed, and with the example of Raymond, actually forced him to finish. There was not this eagerness on the part of the princes to actually accomplish the goal, and so that's who I focused on. I focused on those who, because like I said, they gave up, the life they had in Europe. They sold off their land to get money to be able to support themselves on the journey, and a lot of them had suffered. If they had a horse, their horse probably died. If they had starvation, they had trials, and a lot of drama that happened up until, like I said, Mara, where they're like, listen, we're done with this. We want to get it done. Jerusalem's in sight. Let's go take care of this. And so they forced the issue and made the princes, or at least two of them, finish the journey.
So what are your evaluations of the First Crusade in terms of the purity of its goals versus how things got messed up? Like I know it's a complicated thing, right? I think there's a tendency for people to just say, "Oh, Crusades were evil. They were just this completely evil thing." Oh, or you might idealize it and just say, "Hey, it was just totally justified and good," and right.
Yeah, I think that there's kind of two, not necessarily two schools of thought, but like two understandings of the Crusades. Is like, was it just pious plunder? Like where people just used God and the pilgrimage and that sort of holy, verbiage to basically justify conquest and taking of land and taking of possessions and killing thousands of people in the name of God. Is that the motivation? And that what these people really did? And that's why is that why they went? Because they wanted to just practice what they were doing in Europe in a different place. And I don't buy into that, because, well, maybe for some of the princes like Bohemond and those guys, I think that you can make that case. But when you look at the cost benefit analysis of, like I said, the Freeman farmers and those lower knights who gave up so much to go on the crusade, it's
Hmm.
hard to say that they would do that and not, I mean, not thinking they were going to gain anything. Because if they took any land, they wouldn't be the ones that would get it. It would be the princes. They were the ones who got the land.
So
So
the reward would be a spiritual kind of reward,
yeah,
right?
they look themselves as a spiritual reward, and a lot of the sources actually talk about those who died on the Crusades as martyrs,
Hmm.
not warriors. So if there were sources, if the sources are calling you martyrs, that has a very, and you look at the history of martyrdom and all that. I mean, it's obviously a different idea of martyrdom because a lot of martyrs don't die with a sword in their hands, but that's how the Crusaders and those who wrote about them viewed them, and that's how they viewed themselves. They viewed
So,
themselves as someone who was doing something that had a spiritual goal in mind, not a physical one or a material one.
hmm, yeah, among the non nobles, uh, what do you think that what do you think their main goal was? Is it that you think, or was it kind of righteous indignation? Was it largely, hey, they're, you know, pilgrims that are going to Jerusalem are being persecuted, and we need to make safe way for them? Like I've heard several of these kind of explanations. What do you think is a good kind of explanation of the general person's motivation for doing this?
I don't necessarily think that a good motivation for someone, like I said, to sell off their land and to basically go into debt uh, materially
Hmm.
to help pilgrims not get harassed on a on a pilgrimage. I necessarily don't think that that would be enough for them to take up that much risk and
Hmm.
the obligation. I think that when you look at them as saying, okay, look at the context of their life, is that they are someone who's just like a freeman, so they're not like a serf, but they have an obligation to their Lord to fight other Christians and to kill other Christians in battle. And so the church looked upon them and said, listen, you can't do this because this is mortal sin to kill your Christian brother. It's not just, there's not a just way to just, there's no way to justify medieval warfare in the eyes of the church to where you're okay with killing your Christian brother. And
Hmm.
so they believed they had mortal sin on their soul. And so when Urban came along and said, listen, you have this mortal sin on your soul, here's a way to use your abilities and your skills in combat to get that off your record. And so I think that is the motivation they wanted or needed or had to sell what they had to take up the cross, the patch on their shoulder, and to go liberate the Holy Land, because they said the end result was Jerusalem, and if they liberated Jerusalem, then they get that indulgence, and then their sins they committed in battle in Europe all those years would be forgiven.
Yeah, I think especially secularists, but even I think people who are believers today that might be more secularized in their thinking have a hard time understanding that as a motivation for, especially for selling everything you have and going and doing something like that. Um, so I think for some people, that more skeptical impulse, or that more like we're going to assign bad motives to all of them. Uh, I think it seems like on the face of it, at least, might be at least in part due to the fact that there's a lack of understanding of why that would be such a strong draw to someone. Like they just aren't really believers. They don't understand, like, no, we actually believe these things. We actually believe the Pope, or we actually believe that, we our mortal sins can be addressed by doing this.
Yeah, and like I said, you hit the nail on the head. They believed it. They believed
Right.
in hell. They believed in heaven.
Yep.
They believed that if they die, if listen, so if you died on the way, right, and then your brothers accomplished that goal, then you're going to heaven. Like that's how they looked at it,
Hmm.
you know. That's not to say that once you accomplish that goal and then you go back to Europe and start fighting each other and killing each other, there's not going to be an issue. But at least for this instance, you had an opportunity to use your combat skills to accomplish a goal that would lead to you getting forgiveness for all the things you did against your Christian brothers in Europe.
Right. Yeah.
And that's a huge motivation. Like, if you believe that hell is real and you committed moral sin, and in your occupation, that's just your job. Your job is to kill. that is your how you earn your land. That's how you keep your land, and that's how your society is built. If your society is built on force and, the strongest survive and that sort of thing, and that's how you make a living, what hope is there for your soul?
Right.
I actually compare like medieval knights. If you want to do a comparison of like, kind of a modern understanding, I would say it's more like the mafia.
Really?
Where you have like where you have heads of the family, which are kind of like the nobles, like the princes.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have people that are loyal to them, and they're, they have influence over them, and then they have territories, right? You have different crime families have different territories, and then you have these wars that happen between the crime families, but then they have their own little kind of rules, and they keep their order in their territories in a certain way, through force, through intimidation, through their own means. And that's kind of how knights were, because a knight, was basically, if he had a very big part of land, like a big chunk of land, he was responsible to his higher knight or noble to maintain order in that land. So he had to like be the judge, the jury, and the executioner, and the sheriff, and and so that was his responsibility, to keep order in his land. So that's why I say I think that mafia kind of mentality is or not, analogy kind of fits, I think, more.
Okay. Yeah, well, thanks, Dennis. I really appreciate your time and super awesome discussion. Hope you'll join us again.